Ever had questions about Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible? How he did it, how we got it? I have. So today we're going to talk about a series of questions that maybe you've wondered about also. Questions like, was it an actual translation? Did Joseph Smith use the Urim and Thummim? How many changes were made in the Bible? Was the translation ever completed? Who kept the translation manuscript after Joseph died? Was the translation ever published? And who has the translation manuscript now? Well, let's start with a little timeline, one that you might be familiar with. Let's start March 1830. That's when 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon are printed by E.B. Grandin. If you go ahead just 3 months, Joseph already has a new assignment. The Lord directs Joseph to begin a new translation. He will continue to work on that off and on until July 1833, in which he writes in his diary, "We this day finished the translating of the scriptures." We'll find out if he ever comes back to that. So first question, is the Joseph Smith translation considered an actual translation? Usually when we're talking about a translation, we're talking about translating it from Greek or Hebrew into a different language, right? Well, while working on his revision of the Bible, Joseph did not employ Hebrew and Greek sources, lexicons, or a knowledge of biblical language to render a new English text. He isn't translating it from one language to another. Rather, he used a copy of the King James Bible as the starting point for his translation, dictating inspired changes and additions to his scribes. We'll talk about who those scribes were. So, did Joseph Smith use the Urim and Thummim during his translation? Well, Joseph had a scribe. He starts out with Oliver Cowdery. That will eventually largely be done by Sidney Rigdon. He has a Bible. He has paper. No Urim and Thummim. Why? Because he's given that back to Moroni when he gave the plates back. That's the Bible. That's the actual Bible that Oliver buys from the E.B. Grandin shop. And that's one of the manuscript pages that he uses. There will be over 400 of those, and they'll write on both sides. Well, what does he use the Bible for? Let's jump into some of his translating. Orson Pratt had a couple of questions about how he did it also. Elder Orson Pratt, a member of the 12, told of being present many times when Joseph Smith was translating the New Testament, seeing no interpretive instruments in use during the translation process. He wondered why Joseph did not use the Urim and Thummim as in translating the Book of Mormon. Well, again, as we talked about, he didn't have the Urim and Thummim, and he didn't need it. As Elder Pratt watched the prophet translate, Joseph, as if he read his thoughts, looked up and explained the Lord gave him the Urim and Thummim when he was inexperienced in the spirit of inspiration. But now he had advanced so far that he understood the operations of that spirit and did not need the assistance of that instrument. If you look back in the Old Testament, you'll see that prophets didn't always use one either. Urim and Thummim was used by some, but you have Moses, Noah, Abraham, that are receiving revelation simply by the power of the Spirit. They've tuned their minds to be able to receive that inspiration. Well, this is the Bible. This is the actual Bible that was used. It is a copy of the 1828, what we call the Finney Bible or the Cooperstown Bible. It was published by the Finney brothers in Cooperstown, New York. And this is the actual book that he used. You'll notice that there's no writing in it, at least not right here. Some have wondered, I did, is if he's writing the words that are coming to him, if he's writing the additions or lining out the corrections. Well, what he's actually doing is he's having his scribe initially write down all of the chapters, whether they needed to be corrected or not. And that becomes tedious. This is the beginning of what we would now call Moses 1. And the scribe, which would be Oliver at this point, is writing it all out by hand. That becomes laborious, so they decide to use this Bible for something to speed up the process. And that is that they put little marks, little tick marks here, where there is to be something inserted, changed, corrected, and that's what they enter into the manuscript. As you can see here in Genesis 27, we don't see it at the beginning in Genesis 1 because he's not using the tick marks there. By Genesis 27, you can see he's doing it, and 2 Corinthians, you see they're entering a lot of changes there. You will occasionally see where they'll write their names, or they'll write, on one occasion he writes, "May the Lord bless Oliver," something to that effect. They'll write that, but they don't write any of the additions or corrections. Here you'll see another passage where there's just lots and lots of changes there. And again, those show up in the manuscript. Well, how many changes were made in the Bible? The Joseph Smith translation offers corrections, insights, and clarifications to over 3,400 verses in the Bible. And many of those changes deal with the very passages that make the Bible confusing to read sometime. Can I share one with you? This is one that always threw me. If we go to the book of Exodus, we're in King James Version. This is where the Lord is instructing both Moses and his brother Aaron of how to approach and what to say to Pharaoh. So in the King James Version, chapter 7, verse 2, we have this. "Thou shalt speak all that I command thee, and Aaron thy brother shall speak unto Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of his land." That makes sense. That's okay. How about this verse? This is the one that puzzled me. "And I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonder." What? I will harden Pharaoh's heart? I thought he wanted Pharaoh to let the people go. Why would God harden his heart if... Well, Joseph fixes that with the inspired translation. Here's what it should read. Verse 2 is the same. Notice the difference and how much more sense and clarity it adds when we read this. "And Pharaoh will harden his heart, as I said unto thee, and thou shalt multiply my signs." Make a difference? And that makes lots more sense. The Lord didn't harden Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Well, what's the translation ever completed? Well, there are some differences of opinions on that. We'll dive into that a little bit more here, but Joseph says, the work of translation occupied much of the prophet's time from June 1830 to July 1833. On July 2nd, 1833, Joseph Smith's journal reads, "We this day finish the translating of the scriptures, for which we return gratitude to our Heavenly Father." Is he finished, or is he finished for now? Okay, we'll come back to that. Well, who kept the translation manuscript after Joseph died? Great question. Who had it? Where did it end up? When the saints were leaving Nauvoo, Brigham sent Willard Richards to request the manuscript and the Bible. You got to have both to know how they fit together, right? Emma refused, stating that the manuscript and Bible were Smith family property. In a letter to her son, Joseph Smith III, Emma later stated, "I have often thought the reason why our house did not burn down when it has been so often on fire was because of them." She kept the manuscript in a trunk. It had a false bottom, okay, and kept it there. And the Bible was kept somewhere nearby. But she felt that house did not burn to the ground to protect those manuscript pages and the Bible itself. And I agree totally. And I think you'll see that here in a minute. Was the translation, the manuscript, ever published? Well, the translation manuscripts remained with Emma until she gave them to her son, Joseph Smith III, who led the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Reorganized Church, now the Community of Christ, published Joseph's revision in 1867 under the title, "The Holy Scriptures Translated and Corrected by the Spirit of Revelation." That's kind of a long title. It's an accurate title, but it quickly became known as the Inspired Version of the Bible. So what happened to the Bible? Manuscripts were passed down to Joseph Smith III. What happened to the Bible? Joseph's son, Alexander Hale, he's younger than Joseph Smith III, was given the Bible. And when his daughter Elizabeth was married, her father said, any of my books that I have, you're welcome to have as a wedding present. And she said, I want my grandfather's Bible. And he gave out this little groan. And she said, you promised. So Elizabeth later received it. And she'll get it from her father. She'll marry, go to California, and there her husband is killed in an accident. They come back. When she comes back, she gives it, as it reads here. Elizabeth later gave it to Israel Alexander Smith, the son of Joseph Smith III, who would become also the president of our LDS Church. So is that as clear as ink? Well, let me see if I can clarify just a little bit with a genealogical chart of the Bible and the manuscript. So we have Joseph Smith Jr. and Emma. Now, they have more children than this, okay? We're just going to bring up these two to show you where the manuscript and the Bible end up. But Joseph Smith III, he would have been about 11 when his father was killed. Alexander Hale Smith would have been about 6 when his father was killed. We're just going to bring up these two to show you where the manuscript and the Bible end up. First of all, the manuscript, and then the Bible. Well, as you heard, when Joseph Smith III comes, he asks for the manuscript, and Emma gives him the manuscript. He will put that in the archives, and that will later end up into the archives with Israel Alexander Smith as the president of the church at that period of time. How about the Bible? Well, the Bible's given, right, to Alexander Hale. He gives it to his daughter, Elizabeth. She went by Elizabeth. When she comes back and her husband's gone, she gives it to Alexander so it can be kept in the archives of the church. Now, knowing that, let's open up the front cover of the Bible and see some writing that was done. I'm sure you can't read that unless you look really closely. So we're going to put it up in different text for you. On this side, it says, the Book of the Jews and property of Joseph Smith Jr. and Oliver Cowdery. Underneath it says, bought October the 8th, 1829. That's just right up in this passage here. At Egbert B. Grandin's bookstore, Palmyra, Wayne County, New York. And then down here at the bottom, very bottom here, it reads, paid $3.25. And I'm guessing it's worth a lot more now. On the other side, if we jump to this side here, we'll put the text over here. On this side, it reads, to Vida E. Elizabeth Smith from her father and mother Alexander and Elizabeth Smith. Down here, it reads, this book was a gift from my father, Alexander Hale Smith. I am giving it, so when she's come back, I'm giving it to Israel Alexander Smith because he bears the beloved name of Alexander with honor. And because of my trust in him, I wish it to pass into his care and personal possession. And she signs her name, Vida E. Smith Yates. So that's in the hands of the LDS Church, now the Community of Christ. But it's in their hands for many, many years. And they took care of it. And we're so grateful for that. But when did the LDS Church first gain access to the Bible and the manuscript? Well, there's a great story about an individual named Robert J. Matthews who became very interested in the translation as a young man. Here's part of the story he tells. Our family was active in the church, but I never heard anybody ever talk about Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible. I didn't know he had made one. See, it's not here. It's not common knowledge. We don't know what's happened to it. I didn't know he had made one. On July 9th, 1944, I just had graduated from high school, and I was sitting in the living room of my father's home listening to Elder Joseph Fielding Smith, later become the prophet, give a lecture over KSL radio. Joseph Fielding Smith, for a time, was also a historian for Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. On that day, he was speaking about the Godhead, and he quoted John 1:18, which says, no man has seen God at any time. And then Elder Smith said, Joseph Smith corrected that verse by revelation. And when he said revelation, that word penetrated right into my soul. It was the word revelation that did it. It struck me. It struck him to the heart. It stayed with him. He became very, very curious. Okay, that would stay with him. Well, along the way in 1955, I became a seminary teacher. I wrote a letter to the reorganized church to ask them if I could see the manuscript. He's not acting on behalf of the church. He's just curious. This has put a deep desire in his heart, and he wants to know more. I asked him if I could see the manuscript. They wrote back and said no. There was not a lot of love between the churches at that time. There was a little bit of discord between them. Both churches, great people, but there was just a little bit of disagreements, to say the least, between them. I didn't write every week, but over a period of 15 years, I kept writing, and they kept writing back and saying no. I wrote to the president of their church 2 or 3 times, and each time the answer was no. Then I read in the Deseret News that their church historian had died and that the new historian was Richard Howard. So I wrote him a letter and said, if I came to Independence, would you show me the manuscript? And he wrote back and said, yes. I thought he didn't understand, so I called him on the phone. He said, yes, you can come. Well, all together, and this is abbreviated. We're going to put this passage where you can read the whole conversation where Brother Matthews is interviewed. We'll put that in the description below. It's wonderful, where he gives lots more detail. But here he says, altogether, it took 13 visits from 1968 to 1974. And except for the first one, which was only 1 day, I stayed a week for each of the other 12 visits. I would get there on Monday, be at their office when they opened at 8 in the morning, stay all day until they closed at night, and stay a week. They were not open on Saturdays, so I would be there Monday through Friday. Who has the Bible and the manuscript now? Okay, he's allowed to see that. Brother Matthews is allowed to see that through the generosity of those people. And they build up a friendship. They build up a trust in him. The president of the church will come to him sometimes and say, who are you representing? And he said, I'm not representing anybody. I just want to come and find out more. They build up this great trust until he is able to copy all of the information that is contained in those manuscripts. Well, who has the Bible and the manuscripts now? You may be aware that in 2004, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints purchased from the Community of Christ a number of properties, Kirtland Temple, Nauvoo House, Mansion House, but also included was the Bible that Joseph and Oliver begin with and the manuscript pages. We have those now, which is wonderful that those are in our possession. And we're so grateful to the great care that was given these documents by the Community of Christ Church and the care they took of those buildings, those facilities. Well, was the translation ever completed? Remember, we said we're going to come back to that, right? Well, this is President George Q. Cannon, who was in the first presidency, and he said this: we have heard Brigham Young state that the prophet before his death had spoken to him about going through the translation of the scriptures again and perfecting it upon the points of doctrine which the Lord had restrained him from giving in plainness and fullness at the time of which we speak, which was 1832. So Joseph did want to. Joseph was so pressed with so many responsibilities, and toward the end of his life with so much persecution, he was not able to come back to it, but he wanted to. There's a great quote by Elder Bruce R. McConkie that we have, who was also a member of the Quorum of the 12. The fact that some changes were made in a particular passage or chapter does not mean that all needed corrections were given, even in that portion of the Bible. Important changes were made in several thousand verses, but there are yet thousands of passages to be revised, clarified, and perfected. Someday we'll have that. The Lord will restore, and one way or another, the Lord will restore all those things. But I'm grateful for what we have now. So was the translation really that critical? We didn't have it for a long time. It's in Emma's trunk. It's passed down. We're not given access. So what's the big deal about the translation? Well, here's just one of the blessings that came as a result of Joseph and Oliver and Sidney and the others translating that by the power of revelation. It is significant that over 50% of the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants were received, 50%, during that period of time associated with the formal work of the Bible. They would come across a passage and they'd go, "Whoa, that doesn't make sense. What about that? Let's ask the Lord." Revelation. "Oh, that doesn't make sense." Or there'd be new information given. Revelation. 50% of those revelations that we have were triggered. They were a springboard from what Joseph is translating. That's a marvelous blessing, not just in what we had from the JST, but what we got through the Doctrine and Covenants. And by the way, the JST, we have the first 8 chapters of the Joseph Smith translations found in the Pearl of Great Price, known as the Book of Moses. Precious. All that's been restored there is wonderful. A great outpouring of doctrine and understanding was given through Joseph's effort to translate the Bible. What a blessing. I love this quote by Elder McConkie. The Joseph Smith translation or inspired version is 1,000 times over the best Bible now existing on earth. It was made by the Spirit of revelation, not really translation. It's all revelation. And the changes and additions are the equivalent of the revealed word in the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. Great blessing. So, God in His mercy again has restored these things. God has given us greater light through the prophet Joseph Smith. These works that Joseph brings forth. There's a passage in the Doctrine and Covenants says, this generation, God speaking to Joseph, this generation shall have my word through you. The Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, and the Joseph Smith translation are all fruits of the prophet Joseph Smith. And it's by his fruits we can know that he was a true prophet.